With the deadline for EU-UK Brexit negotiations inching closer every day, and the UK and EU agreeing that there won't be an extension past 2020, the clock for negotiators is truly ticking. Meanwhile, the UK has been turning attention to a potential trade deal with other nations around the globe, such as Australia and the US. With that, however, comes the risk of the UK selling the NHS, or even putting itself at risk of a massive influx of chlorinated chicken. In this video, we'll break down what is truly meant by the claims of selling the NHS or the food wave of chlorinated chicken. We'll take you through the complex and controversial world of trade law to give you an idea of what's going on with all the trade deals as well as what's at stake. Without claiming that trade deals are a bad idea, we aim to bring your attention to what some of the main concerns are with a new US-UK trade deal, and the possible downsides that many people might not be thinking of. If you didn't already know, we have a whole separate channel for US news. We recently discussed Trump's tax returns, Kanye's short-lived candidacy, and the US leaving the World Health Organization. Check out the US channel by clicking the link in the description, and be sure to subscribe while you're there. So, let's make a start. In a previous video on our EU channel, yes, we have a TLDR EU channel too, we talked you through some of the core rules of the World Trade Organization. As we mentioned there, the WTO is both an organization as well as a collection of global trade deals between all of the WTO members, meaning that if two nations don't have a trade deal between each other, then there's still WTO law that applies. The main rules come from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the General Agreement on Trade in Services. These rules are typically aimed at liberalisation, meaning they seek to reduce the extent to which national governments can implement legislation that introduces any kind of barrier to trade. Sometimes, however, nations wish to go further in liberalising trade between them than the WTO rules provide for. If so, they're allowed to make a trade deal together. These deals must, however, comply with two core WTO rules. They may only reduce further the barrier to trade between the parties, but must not raise barriers for others. And they must cover substantially all trade. This is to prevent countries from making lots of small, specific deals in order to circumvent WTO rules they don't like. These rules are a primary reason why trade deals are so difficult, as finding an agreement on substantially all trade means that you can't just leave out areas that you don't agree on. The main controversies, however, run even deeper. The main cause for concern for skeptics of a trade deal, in particular between the UK and US, comes with the cost that the state typically incurs by striking a trade deal, its ability to make public policy. At its heart, a trade deal is about liberalising trade. To ensure this, trade deals protect suppliers from other countries from being exposed to local regulations. However, this also means that when a government feels it's necessary to implement some sort of law, it principally can't do that if it affects foreign trade. It's important to stress that trade deals typically define the scope of regulations that affect trade very widely, meaning that trade deals also seek to minimise the extent that governments can make laws that affect trade indirectly. So, the type of regulations that are at stake are not just those you might typically associate with trade, they might concern literally everything. So, let's take a look at some examples. Back in the Argentinian national financial crisis between 1998 and 2002, the Argentinian government introduced some measures with the aim of managing the crisis and government expenses. These affected gas services, which in Argentina were run by the US company CMS Gas. However, even in the context of a national financial crisis, a tribunal ruled that Argentina had gone too far and ordered a large compensation sum to CMS Gas to be paid, even though, as I've said, Argentina were in the middle of a financial crisis. Another well-known example is litigation by Philip Morris, a large international tobacco company, against Australia. The company incorporated a large branch of itself into Hong Kong, and then proceeded to sue Australia based on a Hong Kong-Australia trade deal from the 1960s. This was all after Australia had introduced plain packaging laws to cigarette packets, something that Philip Morris claimed was a breach of their intellectual property rights. Despite the fact that Australia won the case against them, the entire thing cost Australia 24 million Australian dollars. A final example that's a particularly striking case is between Chevron and Ecuador. Here, the government of Ecuador introduced measures to stop a large oil spill in the Amazon rainforest, which Chevron appealed against, until the company finally lost after more than a decade of legal procedures. So, what's the relevance of all of these things to a potential US-UK trade deal? Well, the fear is that if the UK government makes a trade deal with the US, that could restrict the policies that they're able to implement, due to the fear of receiving large lawsuits from big American corporations. Even if you make an exception in a trade deal, the risk lies in the fact that these kind of disputes are essentially an interpretation of what is a valid public policy justification, even if those policies harm foreign countries and their profits. And sadly, people ruling over these cases, normally international investment tribunals, are not known for being particularly impartial. A UN Special Rapporteur who investigated the status of people's access to health across the globe once reported that the dispute settlement is controlled by a small clique of arbiters and lawyers, and the same person may be counsel, arbiter, and advisor to an investor or state at different times. Many arbiters share close links with business communities and may be inclined towards protecting investors' profits. What further adds to the fear that some have for a US-UK deal is that the other party to the deal is the United States, which is home to a large number of powerful corporations, like those from the pharmaceutical industry. Further, they claim that the issue is worse because of the issues the American political system has with lobbying and transparency. Having explained this, it seems clear that the concerns regarding a new trade deal between the UK and US in the traditional liberalising style go further than the traditional dilemma between market economics and the government's power to make interventions. So let's take a look at two examples of issues that are regularly raised in the UK. Recently, there's been growing fear about food safety if a trade deal with the US allows American meat suppliers to enter the UK without the UK government having the power to introduce health and safety measures. Mainly, the concerns relate to an influx of American chicken meat that contains high doses of chlorine. Under EU law, chemical additives may only be added to food if they are tested to be safe and listed as such. If proven safe, the additive gets a so-called E number, which you often find on the label of food products. These rules are based on the idea of precaution. On the contrary, in the US, the view is taken that a company is allowed to add any additives unless it's scientifically proven that they can cause harm. This policy relies heavily on the principle of scientific evidence. If the UK and US strike a trade deal, the chicken imported from the US may indeed contain chlorine if this is allowed in the US market. And if the UK were to try and implement safeguards against this, it may find itself in a legal dispute with American chicken exporters. But the issue is that it's very hard to predict what will be a sufficient safeguard in a trade deal. The government will predictably say that they have done enough to protect consumers, and the opposition is equally probable to say that public policy exemptions in the deal are too weak. The issue remains that we're only likely to find out who's right after the dispute arises and arbitration has finished, at which point it might be too late. Another oft-discussed criticism is the willingness of the UK government to sell the NHS. This political catchphrase likely refers to the extent to which the NHS will be stripped of its ability to purchase medicine. Trade deals typically require the concluding parties to protect intellectual property rights in their markets. As you probably know, IP rights and patents are a big topic in the context of the medicine and pharmaceutical industries, with the debate likely to reignite in the context of COVID-19. The US has always been particularly adamant on protecting IP rights, and crucially, a medicine with a patent on it is likely to be a lot more expensive than those without. If a large degree of IP protections is committed to, then this will harm the availability of medicine in the UK if it's patented by a US company. Furthermore, the NHS is a large, complex organisation. Opening up the UK market to the US is feared to put the NHS up for sale, allowing US private investors to buy up shares in the NHS. If the UK government wants to prevent this from happening, it will have to explicitly include protective measures that prohibit US investors from buying up parts of the NHS, something that might be very hard to actually negotiate. So there you have it. While it's hardly deniable that cross-border trade has always brought a lot of benefit to the nation, and that trade deals definitely help building up partnerships, skeptics argue that individual trade deals are not necessary because there are always the WTO rules playing in the background, and that often these are enough. More liberalisation would, according to skeptics, bring more harm than good. Whether they're right is subject to debate, but it's a fair point to make that there are indeed a lot of controversies and risks surrounding trade deals. How this specifically applies to the UK-US trade deal will largely depend on the contents of such a deal, and if there's a deal at all. Because, after all, the risks to liberalisation were one of the main reasons why the US and EU failed to conclude their TTIP trade deal that they were attempting to pass for years. A topic we actually discussed in detail on the TLDR EU channel yesterday. There's a link to that video down below. What is certain is that in many trade deals that we see across the globe, governments thought that they properly secured their right to introduce national public policy, but later found out they hadn't. But the risks run much deeper than the classic dilemma between liberalisation and regulation. Where the dispute arises, the costs often run up pretty high, regardless of the outcome. Tribunals and arbiters are also known for not being entirely independent and transparent. And it's not really an option to simply leave out the more contentious areas that both sides can't agree on, because, as we said, WTO rules prescribe that trade deals are only allowed if they cover substantially all trade. So, if there is a trade deal, the UK government will have to be very careful to make sure that it's being transparent with the public about what it's agreeing on, and that's what makes a trade deal so hard to pull off. What do you think though? Do you think that skeptics of a US-UK trade deal have a point? Do you think that a trade deal between the two nations will bring big benefits to the UK? And at what point do you think that trade liberalisation between the two would be going too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when we release further videos. And if you're interested, be sure to check out the TLDR US and EU channels, both of which are linked down below. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name listed at the end of the videos, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.